So welcome to the IoT Leaders podcast, the latest episode with me, your host, Nicole, CEO of SI. And on this call, we really get into the large companies and where IoT is going. You'll hear soon my interview with Mark Thurman. Mark is a guy with a very interesting background. He has an academic background, working with several universities in the US, which he talks about. He was actually involved with BBN, which was the original company that created the East-West link for the internet back in the day. And now he's doing some global roles for IBM around the edge. So he's a very interesting guy, talks about what's held the industry back and where it's going to go in the future, his views on 5G, the technology adoption curve. You'll hear here several references to business books, in particular, Geoffrey Moore, Crossing the Chasm, and the technology adoption life cycle. We talk about satellite, robots, Spot the Dog, and bizarrely, the subject of a sex therapist somehow sneaks in, which was sort of mentioned, and we moved on quickly. So I think, as always, you're going to really enjoy this. And IBM is a big partner of SI's. They're a big go-to-market partner of ours for our solution into large enterprise accounts in particular. So Mark is also making these comments in the context of understanding what it is that we do. So anyway, here it is. So without further ado, let me hand you over to my chat with Mark Thurman of IBM. Welcome to the IoT Leaders podcast.
I've been waiting all of my life for this one opportunity to be an IoT leader. I've been an IoT follower for all these years.
Well, maybe I'll ask you the question at the end of this in about 40 minutes of whether it was worth it. And just to explain to our listeners, so Mark has a new title, so I'm going to read it out here. He is the global distributed cloud and edge leader for IBM, which is very impressive, Mark. And I know you're based in Boston, Massachusetts area. And we're going to get into all of that, what it means, your role, relationship with SI, where you think the market is right now, and where we're going to go in the future. But before we do that, one thing I always like to do on these podcasts is have the audience get to know the guests. So here's the opening opportunity. So can you give us all just a brief potted history of Mark Thurman? Let's just say
the man, the myth, the legend.
The man, the myth, the legend, college onwards in a brief period of time.
First of all, thanks very much, truly, for having me on. I've watched several others of these podcasts, and as you know, because you're a guest on my podcast,
right.
Podcasts have really taken off, and I think they're a very valuable way to convey in a conversational manner, what's going on, or, ideate on the topic. So I think this is a great thing to do. And I do appreciate being invited. My college education was all around being a piano performance major, as I think we've talked about informally, which was absolutely no use for what I'm doing now. During and since college, what I've been doing is working for a number of not only startups, but large technology and telco firms, including a startup or two that I've done. I managed to, I believe I added up, I've raised about 25 million, either as the primary or as the secondary contributor for multiple startups back in the day when 22 to 25 million was real money. So I was the founder and CEO of a company back about 20 years ago called AirPrint Networks, which we took from cradle to neutral exit, which was all around, and it was an IoT company, was all around secure document management, leveraging printers as an endpoint, pre-smartphone. We brought on a team of folks, ex-Polaroid, where I'd also worked. Following that, I worked for GTE Internetworking, which was acquired by Verizon. GTE was, or what was GTE Internetworking, was interesting because it was the company that brought in Bolt, Brannick, and Newman, BB&N, which, aside from all the US political jokes around politicians inventing the internet, actually was the firm that lit up the first internet connections.
Not Al Gore. I'm
Not
devastated.
Al Gore.
No.
Definitely not Al Gore. It was a bunch of very smart people, and you can read about it in a book from New York Times author Katie Hafner called Where Wizards Stay Up Late.
Yeah.
A lot of those folks literally turned on the first east to west node, and I ended up working at that company until its acquisition. I was at Vodafone, where I looked after our Verizon partnership, and was given a few other responsibilities to lead teams in working with the channels and working with other operators like our friends at TELUS in Canada. Then I did my own consultancy, working with Amazon Web Services and a market and data analytics firm and a few other firms for a number of years, doing thought leadership in IoT global strategy. Began engaging with IBM and came on full time on at the beginning of last year, so January 2021, looking after connected edge strategy in the consulting group. And as I think you kind of touched on, I've just this week moved into the cloud group, looking after, again, connected edge and working with industrial and telco and other sectors. Now, the thing I'll highlight is that IBM has been in the IoT business for a long time. We've had an IoT platform called Watson IoT and other things, but we've been categorizing IoT in different ways, and we can certainly iterate on this, but edge is the IBM word, it seems, for IoT and other things. And what I'm learning, and again, we can talk about it because SI is all about connecting things at the edge, is that the definition of edge has expanded. But that's me. The other thing I'd mention is, in addition to my work life, I work very closely in the academic world with a number of groups. I am a guest lecturer at Tufts University, which is a top university here in the Boston area. I've been the chairman of the Connected Things Conference, which we run annually at MIT, 8-9 years of that. I've given guest lectures at MIT as well, at Boston University, at University of Southern California, in the, believe it or not, in the medical school, because we were talking about connecting medical devices. This is a topic and a subject area that I enjoy talking about. I find it very valuable. I'm also an IBM speaker, so I get to speak at major conferences. So where you and I saw each other last in Barcelona at Mobile World
Congress. You're a busy boy, as we say over here.
I was very busy, spoke, I think, 4 times.
Yeah.
So I'm a frequent offender on the speaker circuit as well. Oh, lastly, if you'll allow it, I also host a podcast with my partner called Failure the Podcast. And at some point, hopefully soon, the Nick Earl debut on Failure the Podcast, which is an informal, not technology focused podcast, will emerge from editing.
And yeah, I was going to say, I have already recorded it. I came off the phone and said to my wife, she said, "How was it?" I said, "I have no idea what just happened." Let me just say, and I mean this in a complimentary way, let me just say, I'm hoping to apply a little more structure to this podcast, but it was great fun. You know, with that sort of background, I mean, boy, you did very well to squeeze that into about 2 minutes. You do have a very varied and sort of going across different parts of IoT world and computing and et cetera, et cetera. So that leads me into really asking you the first question as we get into this, which is from an IoT perspective, and we're going to get into the IBM side of things, but from an IoT perspective, many of us, myself included, have been involved 10, 15, I mean, even M2M, I mean, you know.
SCADA.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. The factory floor automation. I mean, we can go back 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, and we'll probably stop there. Although we could go back further. So where are we? I mean, where do you think the market is right now? Because so many people have said they want to do this, but so few people have succeeded relative to the potential of this that we've been aware of for so long.
So first of all, the term IoT, Internet of Things, actually emerged from the MIT Media Lab, where I run my conference. And a guy called Kevin Ashton is credited with coining the phrase. And it's worth looking up how he came up with it, but I'll note, and he's quoted widely on this topic. It was about 22 years ago when he came up with that. He notes that he actually came up with it very quickly to put a title on a PowerPoint deck that he was doing, and at that point the term internet was sexy, so he thought, if I put internet, okay, Internet of Things, that's what,
Yeah, right. I never heard that story. So that was that the
True.
time when Nicholas Negroponte was running the MIT.
It was actually.
Yeah, because I remember that from back in the day. So he basically wanted a catchy title for us. So this whole industry that we're in came out of a guy wanting something that was cool and sexy for a title.
Right. And I'm fond of saying that Internet of Things, it doesn't necessarily mean things on the internet. And actually, you know, I don't want to back into what Asai does, but I recall from our many technical conversations that in many cases, most cases, you don't want your things on the internet. And I know your technology.
We actually say we don't terminate on the internet because it's
right.
You need encrypted data, APNs, and so it's actually things not on the internet. It's just not as catchy an acronym, is it?
Well, that's right. And I know when we were at Vodafone, we switched over from M to M, machine to machine, to IoT, because that became sort of the term of art of that era. So I'm talking about 8-9 years ago. Initially, you know, when I started at Vodafone, we called it Vodafone M to M. Now it's called Vodafone IoT. So I think and I think a lot of folks have a problem, and I'll get into your question, with the use of the term IoT, because they still think that it's just a visible thing accessible off the internet. And if you've put your things on the internet, little pro tip, you failed, because it will be seen quickly and compromised. So the professional, implementations are not accessible on the internet, the so-called internet.
That is a really good way of looking at it, actually, because I think it helps explain something that we have talked about on previous podcasts, and I know you've spoken about as well, is that people think that, oh, well, it is the Internet of Things, and I already have a thing that I can connect to the internet. It's called my cell phone. So actually, it's just things with a SIM card in, and that are connected to the internet. And of course, that's exactly what it isn't. And because it just doesn't work. It's one of the principal reasons why adoption has been held back, because it is nowhere near as just putting a SIM in a device. And anyway, those devices have all had millions of dollars have been spent on them to pre-design them, to certify them, et cetera, et cetera. And most people are having to do their own hardware. And so you would say, from an adoption point of view, does that mean that we're, as the Americans would say, we're at the bottom of the first, bottom of the second, which for non-Americans is a baseball term?
Well, for some of us Americans, I don't even know the baseball terms, but I will. That's not my thing. But yes, there was a book that came out by a guy called Jeffrey Moore, called Crossing the Chasm, 91 time frame. And I actually had the opportunity to meet him a number of years ago at a conference. Actually, I met him and Dr. Ruth Westheimer, who's known as a famous TV sex therapist. At the same time.
Where are we going here, Mark? There could be children.
This is as far as we're going to go. Don't worry. But I do recall.
First appearance of a sex therapist on the IoT Leaders podcast, by the way.
And she's about 3 feet tall, and he's a regular sized human. But I saw him present at a conference, and I was fortunate to have dinner with the two of them together, and it was the most interesting dinner. I recall it 25 years later. But he wrote a book, and several books actually, on the topic of the technology adoption cycle. And we've all seen it. It's a curve, and then he's got a little piece cut out after the second segment, and he calls that the chasm. And he's identified, as I recall properly, that chasm is where a lot of products or a lot of offerings sort of stop. They get stuck in the chasm. And his whole how do you cross over to get to the
option Main Street?
That's right.
Yeah.
And he taught me a shortcut, which I've remembered also to this day, to remembering the technology adoption cycle. So look it up for those listening and watching. But the shortcut is why, try, buy, fly, and die.
Ooh.
So, and this is true. I got this from Jeffrey Moore himself. I'm sure he's presented it publicly, but I recall it. I've written it down. So where are we? Your question is, where are we in the IoT adoption cycle? I think we're in the beginning of the third segment, which I've identified as the buy segment.
Yes.
I think we've had the why. Why do I do it?
Why? We've had the why for a while.
Yeah, and I think we're out of that. I know you've written and spoken extensively on whether or not we're stalled. Yeah. And I know you've referenced, I think it was Cisco's numbers that we're going to have 50 billion devices, and we're only at 19 or 23, depending on which analyst you look at.
Yeah.
I would contend that we're at the early part of buy, and I would contend that we've crossed the chasm for a variety of reasons. The edges become prevalent. Communication capabilities are now ubiquitous. Cellular is probably still the way to go over Wi-Fi or fixed. 5G, and I've just returned from a 5G conference last week that Qualcomm hosted. I'm convinced that 5G, which is an umbrella standard that has underneath it fallback to 4G LTE and support of narrowband and even Wi-Fi. I'm convinced that 5G is really going to drive things. I forget the number right now, but the vast majority of large telcos globally have adopted or begun to adopt 5G as their path forward, and we'll see that for a number of years. And I think in the IoT world, you've got this notion of massive IoT that a lot of the analysts talk about.
Yeah,
I think we're at the
like little just for people listening, like little labels, almost like printable labels for
yes.
Devices, so you can track a chocolate bar or a small
that's right,
massive. So instead of 50 million, 500 million or a trillion devices, and the data from all of those.
That's right. And it is all about the data.
The graphic behind my head, for those of you watching, doesn't mean much for those of you listening, but the idea of, for those of you watching, is the idea of data from everything in one huge network. Yeah,
that's right. So this notion of a temporary device rather than a permanent device, so a printable, flexible device that can go on, vaccines to monitor, cold chain type applications. There, I mean, it's just the cost of the sensors, the cost of the network, the cost of the underlying, nuts and bolts has gone down significantly. Also, there's a greater understanding out there in the systems integration world and the, application world that, connecting things in order to get interesting data is very important. I think I just saw a Gartner statistic that's a year or so old that says something like 75% of all data will now be processed at the edge.
Yeah.
So you've got this migration from all these things are just blasting data up to the cloud. Now the clouds come to the edge, and only the things that need to be sent up, the deltas, if you will, I think are being looked at as being sent up to the cloud. So this is the shift that we're seeing. We're seeing industrial clients and enterprise clients actually get on board in a big way, which is sort of IBM's sweet spot, is industrial and enterprise. So as a result, we're teaming up, Nick, with your firm, as you know, to find ways to help connect things at the edge.
Right, and so that leads us nicely onto the next big subject, and perhaps I can just comment on the previous one before we go there. There's nothing new under the sun, as the Italians. What's an Italian tour guide who just
was that the Italians?
Yeah, nothing new under the sun. Nothing new under the sun. And in IT, there's nothing new. Yes. Because we went from mainframes and minis, and then mainframes to minis to mainframe minis and PCs, and then we added the internet, and then we added the mobile phone, and all we've done is we pushed the definition of the edge further out, and now it's things. But each iteration was at least one order of magnitude greater number of things. And with IoT and massive IoT, it's arguably 2 orders, if not 3 orders of magnitude greater. And at the same time, as you say, the applications move outwards, which means edge processing and managing applications at the edge is where the processing meets the sensors is absolutely critical. And before we get on to the relationship between IBM and SI, that you mentioned 5G, and you mentioned you covered a lot of stuff very quickly there, but there's the whole thing of everything in a factory will be connected. I mean, literally, or a mine or an oil refinery. There could be 10 million things connected on an oil rig. I mean, and there are thousands of oil rigs.
Anything and everything. That's right.
Anything and everything. And 5G also means that what today, and I think people get the factory thing, but then you say to them, well, but everything that's in your office could come off Wi-Fi. And people say, I don't think that's as well understood that 5G, private 5G networks will be implemented by large companies. Yes. And by mobile network operators. But today you're using a Cisco wireless access point, say, as I am right now for my laptop here in our office, but that's going over your corporate network. But with 5G, you could well be using a private or public 5G capability for your office, so that actually things are going to move from the corporate network into a 5G environment. So it's not just new deployments at the edge, it's existing things like your printer or your laptop could well move. And so orchestrating connectivity between Wi-Fi, private 5G, public 5G, going to the edge is going to be a big architectural challenge. And I guess that leads to the opportunity for IBM, because what we're talking about here is and I'd like your view on this, interested in that, a massive opportunity for companies to re-engineer their business processes, their manufacturing, their supply chain, their warranty process, their data architecture, just a massive opportunity. And I guess from a IBM, and particularly IBM Consulting, IBM software products, this represents a huge opportunity for IBM, doesn't it?
I think it does. If you look at factories, factory equipment for decades have been connected within the 4 walls of a factory, primarily fixed. So, cables, Ethernet cables, then Wi-Fi, which gave some added flexibility to reconfigure a production line or move equipment around. What 5G, I think, is providing is greater flexibility coupled with greater security. I know from working with and for several telcos, the notion of a managed service offering from telcos is what they do. I mean, telcos do 2 or 3 things really well. And by extension, folks like your firm, you provide connectivity, you handle billing. Billing is very complex, so you can account for what's being done. And you provide security. I can tell you, having been at the network operations centers of several large telcos, there are people 7/24, 365 making sure that the network is always operational and is, as secure as possibly can be. So I think what's happening now with 5G is you've got this secure managed capability with massive capacity and faster throughput, lower latency, and lots of flexibility. Not everything has to be full on. Let me open the pipe and throw tons of bits at an application. Some of the massive applications are low data rate applications. Think agriculture. Think some light asset tracking where every now and then you just need to check in, and that can be accommodated, I think, quite easily with all forms of 5G. So narrowband or Cat-M1 is now part of that as well. So I think we've got some interesting opportunities in the enterprise. And in the industrial world. And again, IBM's sweet spot has been the largest corporations and governmental organizations and industrial clients. All the major factories, I think all the major corporations, we tend to have some footprint, whether it's just on our, IT side, where we might be helping with Salesforce or some of the other, or SAP deployments, from there to, actually helping on the industrial, Industry 4.0 side, where we've got quite a presence.
Right. And from our perspective, and as you mentioned at the beginning, we the two firms have a pretty close relationship around go to market in front of clients. And you brought the two areas into it there. You talked about IT and the industrial IT, IoT, and the idea of saying, but people, large companies in particular, they want a single architecture that takes all this data from the millions of things in the factory or whatever, the edge aggregation, so that's the outside layer. Then you've got the edge aggregation. So you may have LoRa, BLE, Bluetooth,
right,
satellite, low Earth satellite, whatever, and you've got the sensor information coming into the aggregation device. You've got 80% of the applications being processed at the edge. So you need to manage those applications, which comes back to IBM capabilities, such as extension of Redhat to the edge, and Docker, Kubernetes, application management at the edge, network function virtualization
right,
at the edge. And then you've got the backhaul of it over cellular into the IT architecture. But before you get there, you've got the hybrid cloud interface, where people will have a world of many clouds.
Well, and we have something called cloud satellite, which is not satellite like the things in the sky, that help manage and orchestrate between, workloads between on-premise workloads and the hyperscalers and IBM's own cloud. So we have some interesting capabilities to, containerize everything, leveraging a lot of cool IBM technology. And I'm not even sure if people realize that IBM continues to be a very innovative company that is really at the forefront. Especially, we own Redhat. We've been doing quite a lot with them, even though they run as an independent enterprise. But all those technologies are available to us to help solve problems. And that's what we're here to do, is to be essential and solve client problems ultimately.
Yeah, and that's what I was getting at, because just describing it at a very high level, the way I describe that network architecture, on the one hand, it's complex because it's fragmenting, and it's sort of like the Big Bang theory. I mean, it's the universe expanding and new planets forming. And you have to have an architecture model and policy from the center to the edge. You have to have network level SDN, software-defined networking capabilities. On the one hand, it's really complex, and you can see people say, "Oh my word, it's too complex. I won't cross the chasm. I'll wait on the left bank," if you like.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you have a partner that can put an architecture together end to end that says, "Look, this is how you can take advantage of this," the opportunities for efficiency and creating new experiences for customers are absolutely huge. And our own view is that we're an enabler of that. But actually, from a customer point of view, a lot of the big projects will be driven by global systems integrators, and especially people who have deep technical knowledge, as you're pointing out that you have. I mean, it's not just Redhat, but the software portfolio, and the tens of billions of dollars that you do as a company with the largest corporations in the world are tremendous assets to enable people to move and embrace this world, which is part of the, what did he call it? The buy phase. If the big companies can get across that chasm, and we agree, we talked about this on previous podcasts, we agree that we're into, we've said, once you enable interoperability around a common standard, you hit the inflection point of adoption. And I think that's where we are. And that's eSIM, UICC that we talked about.
Right. Well, because Nick, I'll interject. eSIM gives corporations control.
Yes.
And that's a key element. That's what they want. That's what I think the missing piece was to allow us to cross the chasm, was giving an enterprise or an industrial firm control over how they, communicate, where, what providers. And again, I'm sure you've talked about this on many other podcasts, but the notion of providing control from trusted partners is really what's going to get us. We're already beyond the chasm. I agree with that, which is, I think, the buy phase. Why try buy phase? Buy, I think, Jeffrey Moore called the early majority, if I recall the proper term for this cycle. That's going to last us, I think, a very long time, because we're beyond experimentation. We're beyond POCs. I'm sure you've talked about POC hell for the technology vendor community. I think we're beyond POCs. We're actually onto deployments. I mean, I'm seeing it today that we're now deploying. But the other thing I want to comment on very, very quickly is what IBM's also good at. We've got systems integration capabilities, fantastic technology, unbelievable research. I forget how many PhD researchers we have in IBM research. And I know we're the largest filer of patents globally. But we're also very good at partnering. So we've got large partnerships, all of which have been announced in the past, with very key firms. And IBM, I think, realizes rightly that, especially in IoT, this is a team sport. No one firm has all of the answers. For example, we didn't have a connectivity capability. To me, to get into, really scaling up connected edge capability or connected edge deployments, you need the connected part.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if your TV doesn't receive the signal, it doesn't matter. You can't watch anything.
Well, because we're waiting for the thing to be connected in order to do all the other wonderful things. So again, I think it's made some sense for our two companies to team up to go pursue very large opportunities, or IoT opportunities in enterprise and in the industrial segment, to kind of move things along quickly, solve the problem. In the cases where firms want to work with their existing commercial arrangement with other operators, we can accommodate that through your platform. And I think that's kind of the right messaging. I think the right stuff is, let's go get this thing done. We've got all the capabilities. We give you the control, and we've got a simplified approach to the market.
And that little phrase you just used there, we give you the control. Sometimes it's hard to see the wood from the trees and see what the pattern is, but because we're so close to it, sometimes you miss. I'm just thinking of have you seen that video where the guy's bouncing the basketball and the gorilla walks across the screen, and then you say to people afterwards, did you see the gorilla? And you tell them to count the basketball bounces, and the gorilla waves at the camera and walks off. It's a very famous video. And then you say to them, did you see the gorilla? And like 90% of people didn't see the gorilla. And I use that as an analogy of, sometimes you're so close to things and you're concentrating on things, you miss the really big thing. And I think the really big thing is a technology enabled shift of power. In that, for years and years and years, the game or the business model, the ecosystem was essentially a series of proprietary stacks. You said you work for Vodafone, fantastic company. We work very closely with Vodafone, but Vodafone have a proprietary SIM with a proprietary IMSI, as does every of the 820 mobile network operators. And so the control of the switch, the RSP, the remote SIM provisioning, was essentially controlled by the person who's got their SIM into your device first. The gorilla, in my analogy, is the moment you then say, what if the enterprise controlled the switch? What if the SIM was agnostic, but could connect to anybody? And our model, of course, is not roaming as you know, but is around the ability to currently localize onto 14 mobile network operators via a user-controlled switch. So it's a fundamental shift of control or power from a series of proprietary stacks to a model where a user says, well, I want to do my own IoT, and I want to do 5G, 4G, down to narrowband, and I actually want control of the switch. Could I have control of the switch? And so I can set my own rules.
That's right.
And eSIM in the UICC enables that. And as you rightly say, that is probably, I think when we look back, people will draw these charts and they'll say, oh, it really took off the inflection point. And they'll talk about COVID and whatever. But they'll say from a technology point of view, when we enabled true interoperability between operators, agnostic interoperability of federated orchestration, and at the same time gave users the control over the switch, this is the point at which the market really exploded. And
Right.
certainly that's our belief and our philosophy. So we could talk for hours. I wanted to just go to another area, which is, okay, so let's assume for the moment that we've just crossed the chasm. We're into the people who are going to Main Street, the tornado. Jeffrey Moore puts the tornado.
He also talked about gorillas. He had one called, I think, the Gorilla Game.
He did, yeah. Well, when I was based in the US, I got to know Jeff really, really well, and I think about 3 or 4, brilliant guy, still practicing. In fact, one of our shareholders is SI, runs TCG, the Chasm group in EMEA. So we actually have a major share.
Well, if you talk to Jeffrey, ask him about the Dr. Ruth dinner. He'll remember it.
Okay, well, let's not tell that story on this podcast. I never know where you're going to
go. There's nothing incendiary about that. Just she's an awfully nice lady. I won't go through the topic.
Okay, Dr. Ruth. Well, I'll ask our shareholder to ask Jeff. But where I was going to go is around, where's it going to go? If you assume that there's a technology enabler,
yes,
which essentially enables the shift of power choice to the user, and interoperability, which drives down costs and increased choice. So great, around a common standard, EUICC. So that's great. So finally, after 20, 30 years, we got that component. We cross the chasm, you start to get mass adoption. The question then, the mass adoption is a long curve, not just because there's tens of millions, billions of things that will be connected, but because you then start to be able to do things other than just things as such. So for instance, you mentioned robots, but again, we mentioned
drones.
We mentioned candy bar wrappers, as you call it, sweet wrappers. But then you start thinking about, drones, for example. I mean, it literally is everything being connected. So what's your view on?
Yeah, so my view
in a few years' time.
Yeah, so we've got new ingest points now. The edge now has legs, if you will. The edge has wings. Those are kind of two ways to look at. The edge actually can swim. So I've been working on projects around ingesting data from these new kinds of moving sensors. So underwater, you'll have UAVs, underwater drones that are able to compile data relevant to whatever the industry is that has stuff underwater. We're seeing quite a lot. IBM's done quite a lot with Boston Dynamics, who have this wonderful yellow robot called Spot. You can hear all about it, read all about it. If you come to a major conference and IBM has a stand, you can assume that there'll be a yellow robot walking around, because it's a very big engagement for us, a very big pursuit. And then, we're looking at drones now. One of the panels I was on in Barcelona was a drone panel. And, key companies are now wanting to do things like inspect infrastructure, inspect, bridges, inspect buildings. Tragically, here in the US, roughly a year ago, they had a large building collapse in Miami, Florida. What if one could inspect the building very quickly and easily with a drone that's tied into IoT ingest points and is able to build a digital twin of the building, so that you can kind of take a look without digging into the building itself? Where are some possible stress fractures, if you will? Where are some points where the building might have failures? So again, this is an extension from, again, you go way back. A device was connected on a fixed network inside the four walls of a factory, or in a vending machine, or whatever the early IoT M2M use cases were. We now have relatively inexpensive edge devices that fly, that swim, that, perambulate on their own. And that's something that's new. This notion that you can take a connected robot that can go where humans can't because it's dangerous, or it's tedious. I'm thinking nuclear power plants for inspection. I'm thinking, places where there might be noxious, noxious gases.
Dangerous war zones,
Exactly.
whatever.
Yeah, but I'm even just seeing of industrial applications where I can see if the gauge is in the wrong spot and send it in, and then do something with it. It's more than just a roving camera. In the case of the Spot robot, you can have an arm on it that can grasp and turn and can look at the gauge, notify the human that this thing's out of the standard, and close the leak, if you will. So there's some very, very interesting use cases where, again, the edge now walks, flies, and swims, which is not something you could have said or would have said a while back.
I like that phrase. I haven't heard that. And what was going through my mind as we finish off here is, on the one hand, we talk about getting rid of the siloed proprietary stacks, but that's really on cellular. And you virtualize the switch in the cloud, which is what we do. Right. You make it agnostic across all the world's operators, and you say, okay, well, now everybody can play together through a abstracted agnostic federated layer. But then what you say is, well, hang on a second, that's only cellular, Nick. So that's public cellular wrap types. And then you've got private, people buying their own spectrum.
Right.
Independent companies offering services out with, bypassing the mobile network operators. And then you say, well, that's only a fraction, because you've got BLE, you've got LoRa, I would say Sigfox, but I think that's probably faded away, although
not so much.
Yeah, not so much. But anyway, you've definitely got satellite. And there'll be a lot more of that. And you've got things like what Amazon are doing with Sidewalk. And I mean, there's a whole series of...
It's Helium is another one.
Helium, which is linked to...
blockchain,
crypto. And so the point is, there's going to be new types of proliferation. And our view is that that makes the case even more that you need an abstracted, not just MNO agnostic, but radio access type agnostic switch in the cloud, because without that capability, then you're going to have to, as a user, plug all this stuff in and monitor it and be almost like your own telco,
right?
Because this stuff changes and it doesn't link together, and so it is going to create new complexities, but new opportunities. But I like that phrase. Maybe we should finish on that phrase. So what did you say, that the edge, what was the three?
Swim, can walk, and can fly.
The edge can swim, walk, and fly. Okay.
We
heard it here first.
Yeah, well, it's the first time I've used it, but it occurred to me that that's the right way to look at it. Right. And again, and I know you want to wrap up, but the state of the art has been around a thing with a connected sensor on it, a pipe, a gauge, a car, or whatever. But now these things, have grown legs or fins or wings. And, if you want to talk about like what is the future right now for IoT, it's accommodating these movable edge sensors that provide even a greater view into the enterprise or into the industrial environments. And again, it's shipping tons of data, and it's providing greater insights, which ideally help people offset costs, save money, and increase efficiency. And that's, I think, what have we been doing during the COVID era? We've been coming up with additional ways to make companies more efficient. So that's where I think things are headed in the near term.
And to put a bow around it, one of the other things that Geoffrey Moore proved, as did lots of people like Jim Collins, Good to Great, and Clayton Christensen, the innovators developer, as we're talking business books, is that every wave of technology enabled business model disruption. So not the technology, but the ability for technology to enable disruption. It not only created new opportunity, but actually created a new set of winners and losers. And I think that's the key thing, is that it's not automatic that the leaders of today will be the leaders of tomorrow as these capabilities suddenly become easier, cheaper, faster, smaller. And typically 8 out of 10, and a lot of data around, as you'll know from your business school background, 8 out of 10 leaders in the previous wave are not the leaders in the next wave. And in some cases, it's even higher than 8 out of 10. So that represents both the opportunity and the threat for people because history says that new entrants or companies with a willingness to disrupt themselves are likely see this as an opportunity to leapfrog.
That's right.
Or as some people say, you overtake on the bends, not on the straights. If when change happens, that's when people overtake.
I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen, we could talk about this for hours, and indeed in the past that we have, I know that, Mark, but
that's true.
I am hoping that people found that really interesting. We also covered a selection of business books that if people haven't read, and coined a new phrase for the edge, and managed at some point to get the word sex therapist into this, although I can't remember for the life of me.
You're the first. You just used sex therapist in this wrap up, just for the record. I just said Dr. Ruth. Your mind went somewhere else. It's not on me.
It was early in the recording, but anyway, listen. Thanks again. I know we're doing a lot together as the two companies, and we're proud to be your IoT connectivity partner. So we look forward to working with a lot of clients, and I hope for those of you listening, I hope you found this very, very informative. And I've been talking to Mark Thurman to remind you of his role at IBM. He is the global distributed cloud and edge leader for IBM. And you've been listening to the IoT Leaders podcast with me, your host, Nick Earl, the CEO of SI. So just want to finish by thanking you, Mark, for coming on this podcast. I look forward to my appearance on your podcast being released at some point, and looking forward to the cooperation and the collaboration. I think we covered some very, very interesting ground during this podcast. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me, and really appreciate the opportunity to kind of talk about my favorite topic, which is connecting things.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much. And we'll talk again soon.
Yes.